This podcast will deal with the Articles of Confederation, the type of government that was set up by them, the accomplishments under them, and the weaknesses that would eventually lead to the Constitutional Convention. The Articles of Confederation were the nation's first written constitution. They were drafted by Congress in 1777 and approved by the states in 1781. Under the Articles of Confederation, the 13 states retained their own sovereignty. This meant that states would have supreme power and authority, not the central government. The Articles were set up to make a strong central government impossible, for fear that centralized power would threaten liberty. This was because of the colonists' relations with the British Parliament in the previous years. The national government that was set up was a one-house legislature with each state having one vote. There was no president to enforce the laws and no judiciary to interpret the laws. They were set up to be weak, so major decisions required approval of 9 states rather than a simple majority. This would make it difficult to get things done. Congress only had powers related to war and conducting foreign relations. Congress could make money, but not impose taxes or regulate commerce. Revenue raised by Congress came voluntarily from contributions from state governments. The biggest accomplishment under the Articles of Confederation were dealings with Western land and 3 land ordinance bills that were passed by the Congress. The states agreed to surrender their disputed land claims in the West to the central government. If you look at the East Coast there, in light green, you see the original 13 states. If you look to the west, you see pink and darker green. That was the land that was ceded by the states. Starting from the top of the dark green, you can see land that was ceded by Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Virginia, Kentucky, North Carolina, and Georgia. The federal government was going to establish rules for settling this enormous new domain in the West. Land out west was inhabited by 100,000 Indians, but considered empty by Americans. Americans argued that Indians had ceded their right to the land by siding with the British during the American Revolution, even though only some Indian tribes had sided with the British, while others fought with the Americans. Americans had already been moving west and settling land they had no legal claim to. This worried national leaders who wanted to avoid conflicts with the Indians. So in the 1780s, Congress regulated the way Western land was sold and settled. The first act that was passed was the Land Ordinance of 1784. This divided the region into districts which would first be governed by Congress and then eventually be admitted into the Union as states. The Land Ordinance of 1785 regulated land sales in the Old Northwest. Much of the land was sold to large land companies and speculators who divided the land and sold it to settlers for huge profits, which would lead Americans in the coming decades to demand free or cheap land in the West. If you look at the map on the left, you'll see the green area that was considered the Old Northwest. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 provided for the entry of up to 5 new states into the Union. New states would not be ruled as colonies, but become equal partners with the original 13 states. This way, the country and the government would grow together. If you look at the map in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the Old Northwest Territory. The following maps show you the different states that were carved out of it. So in 1803, Ohio entered the Union. In 1816, Indiana entered the Union. In 1818, Illinois entered the Union. And in 1837, Michigan entered the Union. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 also recognized Indian claims to the land and promised not to take it without their consent. This was mostly done because the government thought the Indians would just leave the land on their own once settlers started appearing. Another great accomplishment of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was that it prohibited slavery in the Old Northwest. But the Articles had their weaknesses, and the weaknesses made an economic crisis in the 1780s even worse. Congress had borrowed large sums of money to fight the American Revolution, and because of its inability to tax and raise revenue, it could not pay back its debts. Because it could not regulate commerce, European goods flooded the market, driving down wages and ruining local businesses. The states each tried to deal with these problems on their own, but the states' solutions were inadequate. In late 1786 and early 1787, debt-ridden farmers who could not pay their taxes closed down courts in western Massachusetts to prevent seizure of their lands. This became known as Shays' Rebellion. The leader, Daniel Shays, was a veteran of the Revolution who believed he was carrying on the tradition of the Revolution by fighting a tyrannical government. The Massachusetts organized an army and put down the rebellion with little bloodshed. But national leaders and influential Americans were fearful of mobocracy or mob rule. Shays' Rebellion helped convince them that a stronger national government was needed in order to improve the economy, protect people's property, and secure law and order. Influential Americans like James Madison of Virginia, who was fearful of mob rule and the excesses of democracy, joined forces with Alexander Hamilton of New York, who wanted America to be a world military and economic power. Together, men like these joined forces with army officers, members of Congress, diplomats, bondholders, and urban artisans who were all looking for a stronger government. In September of 1786, delegates from 6 states met in Annapolis, Maryland. There they proposed another meeting in Philadelphia in which each state would send a delegate for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. This meeting in Philadelphia would turn into the Constitutional Convention, where the delegates decided that instead of revising the Articles, they would scrap them and form a totally new government.